From Jack the Ripper to the Zodiac Killer, history is full of unnerving and perplexing criminals that somehow manage to elude justice. Police annals are rich in crimes that, to this day, remain unsolved. The idea that a killer may still be at large can strike fear and concern into the hearts of anyone living in close proximity to their crimes. Such events can also result in mass panic that can overwhelm even the most grounded of citizens. This was never so true as it was to the citizens of a small Midwestern town in 1944. And the manner in which victims were attacked is truly bizarre. Is it real? Yes, it is. This is extremely strange. On the night of August 31st, 1944, a citizen of Mattoon, Illinois named Urban Graff awakened from sleep feeling very nauseous. At first he thought his wife may have left their gas stove on, but when she attempted to get out of bed to check, she found that she couldn't move. The following morning, a young mother living nearby heard her young daughter coughing, but when she tried to get out of bed to check on her, she too found herself paralyzed and unable to move. The next day, Mrs. Bert Kearney of Marshall Avenue was awakened by a strong, sweet smell in her house around 11 p.m. Thinking at first it might have been the flowers outside the house, the smell persisted, getting stronger, and most alarmingly, she began to lose feeling in her legs. As panic set in, Mrs. Kearney began to scream for help, which awakened her sister, who was staying at the house at the time. Her sister also noticed the odor and deduced it was coming from the direction of an open bedroom window. The police were contacted, but they found nothing out of the ordinary after searching the house and the yard. At around 12:30 a.m., Bert Kearney returned home after completing his taxi driving shift to discover an unidentified man crouching near one of the windows. Noticing he had been seen, the intruder began to flee with Kearney in pursuit, but Kearney could not catch him. Kearney described the man as tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wearing a tight-fitting cap. The man's profile was reported in the local paper, and the effects of the attack would mirror others taking place at other residents in the area, which by September 5th had totaled 6 in all. Initially, it was suspected that robbery may have been the primary motive for the attack. At the time of her incident, the Kearneys had a large sum of money in the house, and it was surmised that the prowler might have seen Mrs. Kearney and her sister counting it earlier that evening. After her attack, Mrs. Kearney reported suffering from a burning sensation on her lips and in her throat, which were attributed to the effects of the gas. Other victims confirmed displaying the same symptoms, along with the temporary paralysis lasting for up to 30 minutes. Local newspapers began to refer to these as gas attacks. The first real clue as to the possible motive of the perpetrator came to light on the night of September 5th, at the home of Carl and Beulah Cordes. When they returned home that night, they found a white cloth on their porch. When Beulah held it up to her face, she was immediately overcome by sensations of lightheadedness and nausea. When her husband helped her inside, over the next 2 hours she experienced swelling in her lips and face, and her mouth began to bleed. Accompanying this was the now common sensation of paralysis in her legs. The police were summoned and took the cloth into evidence. A search of the property revealed a skeleton key and a used tube of lipstick they found near the porch. Again, they assumed this was likely a break-in, and the objects found were dropped by the intruder as he left after unsuccessfully trying to force his way into the home. Beulah offered that perhaps the cloth with the chemical on it was intended to subdue their dog, who typically slept on the porch when they were away from home. An analysis of the cloth found nothing on it that could explain Beulah's reaction. That very same night, on North 13th Street, Mrs. Leonard Burrell had a harrowing experience when she reported witnessing a man break in through her bedroom window and attempt to spray her with gas. As the attacks continued, more descriptions of the attacker flowed in, which lined up with that of Bert Kearney's, a tall, thin man wearing dark clothing and a tight black cap. The police were both baffled and frustrated with the attacker still at large and the dearth of any clues as to his identity. Eventually, 2 FBI agents from Springfield were dispatched to Mattoon, but despite their presence, the attacks continued unabated. Panic among the residents of Mattoon was now setting in, and wild claims as to who the perpetrator could be were running rampant, with theories ranging from an escapee from a lunatic asylum to a German spy testing out a new nerve gas on the populace. All this was taking place, after all, at the height of World War II. As is often the case when a mass panic sets in, speculation and fear act as triggers for extreme and sometimes irrational behavior. Armed citizens groups were established to patrol the streets, and in one case arrested a man who, after passing a polygraph test, was released. Local businessmen arranged a rally on September 10th to try to exert pressure on the already stressed-out police department to bring the attacker to justice. Not the least of their concerns was the negative attention this was bringing to town because simply wasn't good for business. The Gasser, undeterred by vigilante groups or the presence of the FBI, continued the attacks. One incident took place at the home of Mrs. Violet Driscoll and her daughter Ramona, who awoke late one evening to hear someone removing the storm sash on their bedroom window. They sprang out of bed and attempted to run for help, but the fumes overcame Ramona, who began vomiting. Mrs. Driscoll claimed to see a man running away from the house. Later that same night, gas was released into the partially open window of a room where Mrs. Russell Bailey and friends Catherine Tuzo and Mrs. Genevieve Haskell, along with Haskell's young son, were sleeping. At the home of Frances Smith, principal of the Columbian Grade School, and her sister Maxine, they reportedly fell ill when gas was released into their house. They reported the same symptoms of nausea and paralysis others had, as well as the aroma associated with the other attacks. They also described seeing the gas as a blue vapor and hearing a buzzing noise outside that they believed was a spraying apparatus being operated. Yet another couple, Mr. and Mrs. Stuart Scott, returned to their farm late in the evening to find their house filled with odorous gas. By September 12th, it was inevitable that police would begin to receive a growing number of false claims from citizens believing that they smelled gas or seen a prowler, so much so that Gasser reports began to fall into the realm of the boy who cried wolf. Explanations were put forth ranging from zealous overreactions to women's anxiety related to the absence of their men serving in the war. Commissioner of Public Health Thomas V. Wright stated, "There is no doubt that a gas maniac exists and has made a number of attacks, but many of the reported attacks are nothing more than hysteria. Fear of the gas man is entirely out of proportion to the menace of the relatively harmless gas he is spraying. The whole town is sick with hysteria." Chief of Police C.E. Cole took this one step further when he stated that there had likely been no gas attacks at all, and that the reported incidents had probably been triggered by chemicals like carbon tetrachloride or trichloroethylene, both of which have a sweet odor and can induce symptoms similar to those reported by Gasser victims. They posited that fumes from these chemicals had been carried by the wind from nearby industrial facilities, thereby affecting residents. Atlas Imperial, the primary company implicated in this, released a statement of its own, saying that their facility had only 5 gallons of carbon tetrachloride in stock, which was contained in firefighting equipment. Atlas Imperial officials also denied that any quantities of trichloroethylene would have sickened townspeople, reasoning that factory workers would have experienced similar symptoms long before anybody outside of the plant was affected. The last known Gasser attack happened the day after these public pronouncements, September 13th, and the final incident went out with a bang instead of a whimper. Mrs. Bertha Bench and her son Orville were in their home when they saw a woman dressed as a man spraying gas into a bedroom window. The next morning, footprints resembling those made by a woman's high-heeled shoes were discovered imprinted in the ground below the window. After this last bizarre sighting, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was never seen or heard from again. Okay, time out. Remember the empty tube of lipstick that was found near the porch at the Kearney's house? Does this mean that Bertha and Orville's claim of a woman outside their window isn't as outrageous as it appears to be? Maybe the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was actually a woman. We may be onto something here. So, lacking suspects, a perpetrator, a motive, or a conviction, here are some of the theories put forth over who was attacking the citizens of Mattoon in the summer of 1944. Some have suggested that the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was a mad scientist looking to test a new invention. Then there was the local fortune teller named Edna James, who claimed to have come face to face with the gasser and described him as an ape-like man who then doused her with a blast of gas. Holy shit! A few years down the road after these events took place, it was suggested that the gas could have been the work of an extraterrestrial visitor attempting to carry out some extraterrestrial agenda. One oddly plausible theory is that the gasser was part of a secret military project that was using the citizens of a small Midwestern town as test subjects for a new gas to be used in the ongoing war effort. Not like that has never happened. Some believe that the mass hysteria was triggered by the headline in the September 1st edition of the Mattoon Journal-Gazette, which read, "Mrs. Kearney and daughter first victims," which subtly suggested that more attacks might follow. Scott Maruna, a high school chemistry and physics teacher in Jacksonville, Illinois, put forth an intriguing possibility in his book, The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Dispelling the Hysteria. Mattoon had themselves a real town genius who spent the bulk of his time reading at his family's grocery store. His name was Farley Llewellyn, who, it said, was a heavy drinker, had a secret laboratory, and experimented with various chemicals. At one point, the entire neighborhood was rocked by an explosion that happened in his lab. Maruna writes, Farley, the obvious chemical genius behind the gas's synthesis, was the real gasser. In a fit brought on by mental instability and years of pent-up rage against a town that would not and could not accept him, Farley tinkered and toyed with various organic solvents in an attempt to create a suitable weapon. Now, Maruna identifies Farley's chemical of choice as tetrachloroethane, which has all the properties necessary to induce the type of symptoms found in the residents of Mattoon. Author and paranormal and true crime researcher Troy Taylor put forth an equally interesting tidbit in his article for American Hauntings on this same subject. He wrote, "Interestingly, I was sent a letter in 2002 from a woman who explained to me that her father grew up in Mattoon during the time when the gas attacks were taking place. He told her that there had been two sisters living in town at the time who had a brother who was allegedly insane. A number of people in town believed that he was the Mad Gasser, and so his sisters locked him in the basement until they could find a mental institution to put him in. After they locked him away, her father told her, the gas attack stopped. Is this the answer to the mystery?" Okay, so what happened to the people of Mattoon, Illinois in the summer of 1944? Three possible explanations have been put forth that might explain it. One, yes, there was probably some form of mass hysteria that gripped the town as people began to imagine attacks and completely blow things out of proportion. The idea that you could be next is enough to rattle anyone's cage and put people on a constant state of alert. What didn't help is probably the next scenario. Number two, some intrepid reporter looking to break the big story and make a name for himself played on people's fears and overhyped the entire situation. Hard to say who that was because bylines and attributions weren't really big back then. But as time went on, the stories began to take on a more dismissive nature or kind of tongue-in-cheek quality, perhaps because the editor caught on to this and decided that they needed to dial it down a little bit. Maybe that decision was influenced by public officials or concerned businessmen who just wanted to tone down the rhetoric a little. The third explanation is yes, there likely was a Mad Gasser on the loose in Mattoon, Illinois, because don't forget, the Kearney sighting and that of the mother the following day weren't really tied to each other. It's not like you could post it on Twitter in 1944. So, despite all the hysteria and fear that gripped Mattoon, there's one inescapable fact. Somebody, someplace, saw something that wasn't right and was potentially life-threatening. I believe there was a Mad Gasser, and that they meant to do harm to people in some form. Frustratingly, the thing that we may not ever have an answer to is why?